Most men never notice how often they explain their frustration to the air, to strangers, to themselves. Complaining feels like relief, yet nothing changes after it. The tension remains. The respect does not return. What if irritation is not caused by circumstance, but by permission? The day a man stops narrating his discomfort, something unsettles the world around him. Silence begins to concentrate force. And force, once contained, alters outcomes. Lesson 1. The first truth behind times the day you stop complaining, you become dangerous. Times is simple. Complaints do not merely describe weakness, they distribute it. Every time a man explains why something is unfair, slow, incompetent, or disappointing, he performs a quiet transfer of authority away from himself. He waits for agreement. He searches for witnesses. And in that moment, control leaves the room. Most complaints are not spoken to solve problems. They are spoken to regulate emotion, a delayed payment, a disrespectful colleague, traffic that refuses to move, plans that collapse at the last minute. The mouth opens before the mind settles. Words rush forward as if expression itself were action, but nothing has moved except air. History has already tested this pattern. Noise feels productive because it resembles movement, yet outcomes remain unchanged. Notice how often complaining gathers an audience. People lean closer when dissatisfaction is shared. There is comfort in mutual frustration. A man complains about work, another agrees, and suddenly both feel justified. But justification is not progress. Agreement becomes anesthesia. The problem survives untouched while energy dissolves through conversation. The room fills with explanations instead of decisions. Complaints kill power because they announce dependency. When a man repeatedly describes what others should have done differently, he quietly reveals that his stability depends on their behavior. Respect does not grow around dependency. Even sympathetic listeners begin to withdraw their confidence, not consciously, instinctively. Reliability is sensed through restraint, not narration. Consider two men facing the same obstacle. One explains why circumstances are unreasonable. The other studies the obstacle without commentary. Which one appears more capable? Which one feels dangerous to oppose? Silence changes posture. It signals calculation instead of reaction. People assume depth where words are absent. Sometimes they are wrong. Often they are not. There is also a private consequence. Complaining trains the mind to rehearse limitation. The brain repeats whatever receives language. Say something often enough, and it becomes architecture. A man who constantly names barriers begins to search for them automatically. Opportunities arrive disguised as inconvenience and pass unnoticed because irritation has already occupied attention. The tongue spends what discipline tries to save. This is why restraint unsettles others. When you stop explaining what bothers you, observers lose access to your emotional map. They cannot predict where pressure will break you. They cannot measure frustration through tone or volume. You become difficult to manage because reaction is no longer visible. Not aggressive, not loud, simply unavailable to manipulation. Some believe silence means suppression. It does not. Suppression hides emotion without transforming it. Discipline converts emotion into direction. The irritation that once fueled conversation begins to fuel observation instead. You notice patterns. You recognize who wastes time. You adjust position quietly. Results start appearing without announcement, and people struggle to understand when the shift began. Complaining once felt like honesty. Now it feels expensive. Every unnecessary word exposes intention before strategy is ready. Every emotional explanation gives others material to negotiate against you. The world rarely argues with the man who stops arguing with circumstances. It waits to see what he will do instead. Lesson 2. The first principle after times, the day you stop complaining, you become dangerous times, is that the world does not punish frustration. It ignores it. Many men believe complaints fail because others are cruel or indifferent. The truth is quieter. Repeated dissatisfaction becomes background noise. Once a man explains the same struggle often enough, listeners stop hearing urgency and begin hearing habit. Observe workplaces, families, friendships. The man who constantly points out what is broken eventually receives polite nods instead of solutions. Not because people disagree, but because they sense no consequence attached to his words. Complaint without adjustment teaches others that nothing will change, regardless of what they do. End quote. Over time, his voice loses weight, even when he is finally correct. This erosion happens slowly. At first, complaining feels like accountability. He believes he is defending standards. He names incompetence. He exposes inefficiency. But repetition transforms vigilance into predictability. Others learn that he releases pressure through speech rather than action. They wait for the storm of words to pass. Then everything resumes exactly as before. Why does restraint alter this dynamic? Because silence introduces uncertainty. When dissatisfaction disappears from language, observers lose reassurance. They no longer know whether the problem has been accepted or recorded. Human behavior adjusts quickly when outcomes cannot be predicted. A quiet man forces interpretation. People begin to monitor themselves in his presence because they cannot measure tolerance. Consider a simple situation. A colleague misses deadlines repeatedly. One man complains openly each time. He explains how difficult this makes his work. He vents frustration during meetings and afterward. Another says nothing. He reorganizes responsibilities, documents delays, redirects communication upward when necessary. Weeks later, one man is known for frustration. The other is known for results. Which one becomes difficult to ignore? Time has proven this pattern. Influence accumulates around those who conserve speech until action is ready. Silence is not absence of judgment. It is judgment withheld from display. Others instinctively treat withheld judgment with caution. Exposure feels manageable. Mystery does not. There is also a psychological shift that occurs internally. Complaining creates a temporary alliance with weakness. It tells the mind that emotional discharge equals resolution. The body relaxes prematurely, believing the problem has been addressed because tension was expressed. Energy dissipates before strategy forms. The situation remains unchanged, but motivation quietly fades. A restrained man experiences discomfort differently. Irritation remains inside long enough to become structured thought. Questions appear. What is controllable? What is leverage? What must end? Instead of seeking agreement, he searches for movement. Others sense this transition without understanding why. Conversations around him become shorter, and decisions around him become sharper. The world listens when words become rare. This is why restraint attracts attention without announcement. When a man who once complained begins to observe instead, the environment adjusts its posture. Some grow uneasy, others grow respectful. Not because he demanded anything, but because unpredictability replaced familiarity. People negotiate carefully with what they cannot read. Danger does not begin with confrontation. It begins when dissatisfaction stops seeking witnesses. When irritation no longer asks permission to exist, it becomes direction. And direction, once formed without noise, begins to reorganize everything around it long before anyone notices the change taking shape. Lesson 3. The first truth hidden inside times the day you stop complaining, you become dangerous times, is that many men do not complain because life is unbearable. They complain because it is comforting. Discomfort alone does not produce speech. Expectation does. A man believes effort should be recognized. Respect should be automatic. Progress should feel fair. When reality refuses the script, complaint becomes negotiation with disappointment. There is relief in saying, "This shouldn't be happening." The sentence creates distance between identity and outcome. Failure belongs to circumstance. Delay belongs to others. Fatigue belongs to bad timing. For a moment, dignity feels protected, but relief has a cost. Every explanation that protects the ego also postpones adaptation. The mind stops searching for leverage because it has already secured emotional permission to remain where it is. History has already tested this pattern. Groups bonded through shared dissatisfaction rarely move forward together. They stabilize around grievance. Conversation becomes ritual. The same stories repeat. The same enemies are named. Energy circulates without direction. Comfort replaces momentum. A man can spend years surrounded by agreement and never notice that nothing in his life has advanced. Complaining disguises itself as honesty because it contains truth. Conditions may genuinely be unfair. People may genuinely disappoint. Systems may genuinely waste effort. The danger is not accuracy. The danger is attachment. When frustration becomes identity, improvement begins to feel like betrayal. If the problem disappears, what remains to discuss? Silence threatens belonging more than failure threatens progress. Watch what happens when someone stops participating in collective frustration. Conversations grow awkward. Others attempt to pull him back with questions. Don't you see how ridiculous this is? They are not seeking analysis. They are seeking reinforcement. Agreement confirms stability. Refusal forces responsibility back into their hands. Few welcome that exchange. There is also fear beneath the habit. Complaining delays risk. As long as a man explains why something cannot work, he never has to test whether he can. Action exposes competence. Speech protects imagination. It is safer to describe obstacles than to remove them and discover what ability actually exists. Silence removes that shelter. Without explanation, only outcomes remain. The complaint comforts the man who refuses to move. Danger begins when comfort loses authority. The same irritation that once fueled conversation starts fueling observation instead. He notices how often people predict failure before attempting change. He notices how quickly energy drains in rooms where responsibility is shared but ownership is absent. Slowly, he withdraws participation from emotional exchanges that lead nowhere. This withdrawal is misunderstood. Others assume resentment or arrogance. In reality, attention has shifted inward. Problems become puzzles rather than injustices. Instead of asking who caused inconvenience, he asks what position removes dependence entirely. Small adjustments accumulate quietly. Different routines, different alliances, different standards of tolerance. The world rarely reacts immediately to this transformation. At first, nothing seems different. He still works, still listens, still occupies the same spaces. But something has ended. Emotional negotiation with reality no longer occurs in public. Observers sense distance without hostility. Familiar reactions fail to appear. And when familiar reactions disappear, control begins to migrate toward the man who no longer seeks comfort through explanation. Lesson 4. The first principle within times, the day you stop complaining, you become dangerous times, is that silence is not emptiness. It is pressure. Most men misunderstand silence because they associate power with visibility. They believe authority must be asserted, defended, explained. Yet the moments that alter relationships rarely arrive through argument. They arrive when reaction disappears. Complaining exposes emotional timing. Others learn exactly how long irritation takes to surface, what tone signals exhaustion, which subjects trigger frustration. patterns become readable. Once a man becomes readable, he becomes manageable. People adjust behavior just enough to calm him, never enough to change. The cycle continues because expression provides them a map. Silence removes the map. Imagine disagreement during a meeting. One man immediately explains why a decision is flawed. His voice rises slightly, urgency clear. The room listens politely, counters appear, discussion stretches. Everyone leaves believing participation occurred. Nothing truly shifts. Another man hears the same decision and says little. He asks one precise question, or none at all. Later, adjustments appear through action rather than debate. Resources move, alliances change, outcomes redirect quietly. Which approach alters reality more deeply? Time has proven that visible resistance invites negotiation. Quiet resistance invites caution. When dissatisfaction is not verbalized, observers cannot measure intensity. They begin imagining consequences themselves. Human minds fill silence with projection. Often, they assume greater resolve than actually exists. Silence multiplies perceived depth without effort. This does not mean withdrawal from responsibility. It means selecting the moment of expression instead of surrendering it to emotion. Complaining speaks immediately because discomfort demands release. Discipline waits until speech produces leverage. The difference is rarely dramatic from the outside, yet its effects compound across years. There is also a change inside the man himself. Words scatter attention. Each explanation divides focus between feeling and performance. He begins editing tone, searching for agreement, defending interpretation. Silence removes performance entirely. Observation sharpens. He notices who interrupts, who deflects blame, who listens only when advantage appears. Information accumulates without resistance because no one feels challenged. Silence is not absence, it is selection. Social dynamics respond quickly to this shift. Some individuals grow uneasy because emotional exchanges no longer anchor interaction. They test boundaries with small provocations, expecting familiar complaints. When none arrive, uncertainty replaces confidence. Others begin offering respect unconsciously. They speak more carefully, justify decisions more clearly, anticipate consequences that were never announced. The dangerous element is not aggression, it is containment. A restrained man does not advertise dissatisfaction, yet nothing escapes his attention. Opportunities appear because he is no longer occupied defending feelings. Resources move toward reliability. Responsibility gravitates toward those who do not exhaust rooms with reaction. Many fear silence because they imagine resentment building underneath it. But resentment seeks witnesses. Discipline seeks direction. The difference becomes visible only through time. Weeks pass. Situations that once triggered explanation now produce adjustment. Boundaries appear without speeches. Decisions arrive without emotional rehearsal. Eventually, others realize something has changed, though they struggle to name it. Conversations around him shorten. Arguments fail to ignite. Influence grows without volume. And the environment begins to reorganize itself around the quiet pressure of a man who no longer releases strength through unnecessary words. Lesson 5. The first truth within times. The day you stop complaining, you become dangerous. Times is that responsibility loses strength the moment it asks to be seen. Many men believe progress requires explanation. They announce effort, describe obstacles, narrate exhaustion as proof of commitment. It feels honest. It feels deserved. Yet, the more struggle is displayed, the less authority it carries. Complaining often hides inside responsibility, disguised as transparency. A man says he is only explaining how difficult things have been. He lists sacrifices, interruptions, unfair expectations. Each sentence appears reasonable on its own, but slowly the focus moves away from outcome and toward recognition. Attention replaces execution. Others begin responding to emotion instead of results. History has already tested this pattern. Those who announce effort invite evaluation of effort rather than evaluation of effectiveness. Conversations shift toward sympathy or debate. Was the task truly unfair? Were the circumstances exceptional? Energy becomes absorbed by interpretation. Meanwhile, the man who works without narration forces attention toward consequence alone. People measure what changed, not how loudly struggle was described. Consider the difference between two leaders managing failure. One gathers everyone and explains frustration openly. He names the pressure above him, the lack of support, the mistakes of others. The room understands his difficulty. They may even admire his honesty. But uncertainty spreads because responsibility now feels shared with circumstance. Another leader says little. Adjustments appear the next day. Roles change. Expectations sharpen. No speech announces disappointment, yet everyone feels it. Which environment produces correction faster? Complaints dilute responsibility because they externalize weight. Once hardship becomes public explanation, part of the burden transfers outward. Relief arrives too early. The mind settles before transformation begins. Discipline requires discomfort to remain long enough to generate structure. Silence allows discomfort to concentrate instead of evaporate. There is also a deeper social consequence. People trust those who carry pressure quietly, not because suffering is noble, but because restraint suggests stability. When a man repeatedly explains why tasks are difficult, observers begin preparing for inconsistency. They anticipate excuses before failure occurs. Reliability weakens long before performance actually declines. Work loses gravity when it seeks applause. Danger emerges when responsibility no longer requests validation. The man who stops explaining effort becomes difficult to evaluate emotionally. Others cannot measure exhaustion or frustration through tone. They must judge only by outcomes. This creates distance between intention and perception. Negotiation loses emotional leverage because nothing has been offered publicly. This restraint changes internal dialogue as well. Without narration, excuses struggle to survive. The mind cannot rehearse injustice through conversation. It must confront limitation directly. Questions become sharper. What must change immediately? What dependency must end? Which habit quietly sabotages progress? Answers appear without comfort because comfort was never invited. Some misunderstand this silence as coldness. They expect visible strain as proof of sincerity. When it disappears, suspicion rises. Yet over time, suspicion fades. Consistency replaces doubt. Projects stabilize. Conflicts shorten. Opportunities approach cautiously at first, then, more frequently, drawn toward predictability. Responsibility without announcement removes drama from effort. There are no speeches before adjustment, no emotional negotiations before decisions, only movement, only correction, only consequence. And those watching begin to realize they are no longer dealing with a man who seeks understanding before acting, but with one who allows action itself to speak long before words ever arrive. Lesson 6. The first principle inside times, the day you stop complaining, you become dangerous times, is that irritation is not an obstacle to discipline. It is raw material. Most men waste it because they release it too quickly. A sharp comment from a superior, a client who changes expectations, a partner who dismisses effort. The emotional reaction appears instantly. Words follow. The complaint escapes before understanding has time to form. Complaining feels like pressure leaving the body. The shoulders loosen, breathing slows. Agreement from others provides confirmation that frustration was justified. But relief achieved through speech empties the very energy required for correction. Anger dissolves into conversation instead of direction. The situation remains untouched, while emotion fades into fatigue. Time has proven that irritation contains information. It marks friction between expectation and reality. Something is misaligned, a boundary ignored, a dependency exposed, a weakness revealed. When a man complains immediately, he abandons investigation. He chooses discharge instead of analysis. The lesson disappears, along with the emotion that carried it. Consider a simple example. A project fails because another person delays delivery. One man vents openly. He explains incompetence, recounts wasted hours, gathers sympathy. By the next morning, his anger has cooled, yet nothing structural has changed. The same dependency remains. Another man says little. He studies the delay quietly. Contracts adjust. Communication routes shift. Backup systems appear. Weeks later, the same failure cannot occur again. Which one actually responded to the problem? Irritation becomes leverage only when contained long enough to mature. Silence forces attention inward. Questions replace accusations. Why did this situation have power over me? Where was control surrendered? What system allowed repetition? These questions are uncomfortable because they remove innocence. Responsibility expands, yet expansion creates freedom. Others never notice forming. The disciplined man harvests what the reactive man discards. Social environments react strongly to this change. When complaints disappear, observers lose emotional reassurance. They cannot calm frustration through agreement because frustration is no longer displayed. Some attempt to provoke reaction deliberately. Sarcasm appears. Delays increase. Small disrespect tests whether the old pattern still exists. When reaction fails to arrive, caution replaces experimentation. This restraint does not eliminate anger. It refines it. Anger without direction becomes noise. Anger guided through patience becomes architecture. Decisions grow cleaner because they are not shaped by the need to feel understood. They are shaped by consequence alone. Others experience adjustment without witnessing the emotion that created it. There is also a private transformation that few discuss. Complaining divides identity. A man hears himself describe powerlessness repeatedly until the description feels permanent. Silence interrupts this rehearsal. Without spoken limitation, the mind begins searching for agency automatically. Solutions appear because attention finally has space to notice them. Danger emerges quietly here, not through confrontation, not through dominance, but through efficiency. The man who converts irritation into structure stops repeating mistakes others accept as normal. Time returns to him because emotional recovery no longer consumes entire evenings. Energy accumulates instead of leaking through conversation. People eventually sense the difference. Problems around him shorten. Boundaries appear without speeches. Negotiations end faster because patience signals readiness rather than hesitation. They may not understand why resistance feels heavier now, only that outcomes change when pressure meets a man who no longer wastes discomfort, explaining why things should have been easier. Lesson 7. The first truth within times, the day you stop complaining, you become dangerous times, is that emotional exposure has a price few men calculate. Speaking frustration openly feels honest, even courageous. Modern environments reward expression. Meetings encourage sharing. Conversations invite vulnerability. Yet every disclosure teaches others how to approach you, how to slow you, how to negotiate against you. Complaints reveal patterns. Tone exposes tolerance. Timing exposes fatigue. A man who repeatedly explains what exhausts him unknowingly drafts instructions for those who compete with him. Not everyone listens with kindness. Some listen for advantage. They notice when patience disappears, when pressure produces reaction, when insecurity appears behind explanation. Information travels silently through observation long before it is ever used. Time has proven that influence belongs to those who control interpretation. When dissatisfaction becomes public language, interpretation escapes ownership. Others decide whether frustration sounds justified or exaggerated. They measure emotional stability without permission. Respect weakens not because the complaint lacked truth, but because exposure invited judgment. Consider negotiation. One man enters already explaining difficulty. He mentions limited resources, stress from deadlines, exhaustion from previous delays. He believes honesty builds cooperation. Instead, leverage shifts immediately. The other side senses urgency. Concessions become expected. Another man speaks only about outcomes. No irritation appears. No fatigue is offered as context. Negotiation becomes cautious because uncertainty replaces emotional access. Complaining creates familiarity. Familiarity removes caution. When reactions are predictable, pressure becomes easy to apply. People know which subjects provoke explanation. They know when silence will eventually break. Control migrates toward whoever waits longest. Discipline is rarely loud. It is patient enough to allow others to reveal themselves first. The man who explains himself too often becomes easy to steer. This does not demand coldness or isolation. It demands selection. Emotional expression has a place among those who have earned proximity, but public frustration blurs boundaries. Not everyone deserves insight into internal battles. Some individuals collect vulnerability without ever offering loyalty in return. Silence protects energy from becoming currency in someone else's strategy. There is also an internal consequence. Repeated exposure fragments focus. A man revisits the same irritation through multiple conversations, reliving emotion each time. Recovery stretches unnecessarily. Resentment grows because the story never truly ends. Silence shortens emotional lifespan. Without repetition, irritation fades faster, leaving space for decision rather than memory. Social dynamics adjust quickly when emotional access disappears. Colleagues choose words more carefully. Friends observe behavior instead of tone. Even conflict changes shape. Arguments struggle to begin when reaction is absent. Opponents lose rhythm because familiar triggers no longer produce predictable responses. Danger appears here without aggression, not because others fear anger, but because they cannot measure it. Boundaries exist without explanation. Disappointment exists without performance. A restrained man becomes difficult to categorize. Some interpret calm as indifference. Others interpret it as calculation. Both reactions create distance, and distance creates authority. Conversations shorten, negotiations sharpen. Respect forms not through demand, but through uncertainty. People hesitate before testing limits they cannot see. They move carefully around a man whose emotional landscape is no longer publicly mapped, unsure whether silence signals patience, decision, or the moment before something irreversible quietly begins. Lesson 8. The first principle, inside times the day you stop complaining, you become dangerous times, is that reality does not argue back. Many men exhaust themselves debating circumstances as if fairness were negotiable. They speak to delay, inconvenience, betrayal, or loss, as though explanation might soften consequence. Complaints become a courtroom where emotion presents arguments against what has already happened. Reality never attends the hearing. A delayed opportunity does not return because frustration was justified. Disrespect does not reverse itself because anger sounded reasonable. Time does not slow because exhaustion feels deserved. Yet the act of complaining creates the illusion of engagement. The mind believes it has resisted defeat simply because it spoke against it. Resistance becomes theatrical rather than structural. History has already tested this mistake. Entire lives stall in arguments with events that cannot hear defense. Energy moves backward instead of forward. A man explains why something should not have occurred while the next moment waits unattended. Opportunity rarely announces itself loudly. It appears quietly beside disappointment. Those still explaining yesterday often miss it entirely. Consider failure in business or career. One man spends weeks describing market conditions, unreliable partners, economic timing. Everything he says may be accurate. Listeners sympathize. Nothing changes. Another man studies the same loss without commentary. Contracts tighten, exposure reduces, skills expand where weakness appeared. Months later, observers call him fortunate. They never witness the silence where adaptation began. Complaining assumes justice must precede movement. Discipline assumes movement must precede justice. Waiting for emotional satisfaction before adjustment traps effort behind expectation. Silence removes negotiation entirely. The event occurred. Now what? This question carries no drama, only direction. The world yields only to what moves. There is discomfort in accepting this. Without complaint, innocence disappears. If explanation is removed, responsibility grows heavier. A man must confront how often he waited for apology instead of building independence. He notices how many delays survived because argument felt easier than change. These realizations sting because they remove familiar refuge. Social environments respond differently as well. When a man stops arguing with circumstance, observers lose opportunity to comfort him. Sympathy declines. At first, this feels like abandonment. In truth, it is freedom. Conversations stop revolving around hardship. Interaction becomes practical. People approach with solutions or stay away entirely. Both outcomes reduce noise. Silence also sharpens perception of control. Instead of cataloging injustice, attention searches for variables that still belong to him. Time allocation, skill acquisition, financial exposure. Physical endurance, relationships maintained out of habit rather than loyalty. Adjustment begins quietly, often invisible even to close observers. Others may misinterpret this shift as acceptance of poor treatment. They expect protest as proof of dignity. Yet restraint does not excuse injustice. It refuses to waste strength arguing with what cannot hear. Correction appears through repositioning instead of outrage. Boundaries form through distance rather than speeches. Danger grows here because adaptation accelerates. While others debate fairness, the restrained man moves. Momentum compounds silently. Opportunities align with readiness rather than emotion. People eventually notice results without remembering when complaints disappeared. They only sense that resistance meets less friction now, as though reality itself negotiates differently with someone who stopped demanding explanation and began answering circumstance with movement alone. Lesson 9. The first truth inside times, the day you stop complaining, you become dangerous times, is that speech does not only communicate emotion, it manufactures perception. Most men believe reputation forms through achievement alone. They overlook how daily language quietly edits how others interpret those achievements long before results are measured. Complaining reshapes identity through repetition. A man may be competent, disciplined, even reliable, yet constant dissatisfaction colors everything he does. Others begin associating him with difficulty rather than capability. Invitations arrive less frequently. Opportunities move toward those who appear easier to work with. Not because competence disappeared, but because emotional cost became visible. Time has proven that perception rarely waits for evidence. People decide quickly who feels stable under pressure. They listen for tone more than content. A single frustrated explanation can outweigh months of silent performance because emotion is memorable. The brain catalogs discomfort as risk. Gradually, conversations about responsibility occur elsewhere, leaving the complaining man wondering when momentum shifted away from him. Consider leadership selection in any environment. One candidate openly describes exhaustion, unfair expectations, constant obstacles. Everything he says may be true. Another speaks briefly, focuses on outcomes, rarely discusses personal strain. Decision-makers instinctively move toward the second. Reliability appears heavier than honesty because uncertainty feels expensive when responsibility increases. Complaints also weaken authority during conflict. When disagreement arises, prior emotional exposure becomes reference material. Others recall frustration and assume reaction will follow. Arguments escalate because expectations already exist. Silence removes expectation. Without predictable emotion, confrontation slows. Opponents hesitate, unsure how far pressure can extend before consequence appears. The tongue drafts a reputation long before actions sign it. There is also an internal distortion. Repeated complaints teach the mind to view itself through limitation. Identity becomes narrator instead of actor. A man begins describing life as something happening to him rather than something shaped by him. Even success feels temporary because language has rehearsed instability for too long. Control of speech interrupts this erosion, not through artificial positivity, not through forced optimism, but through omission. Irritation exists without announcement. Fatigue exists without advertisement. Others must interpret capability through observation alone. Gradually, perception stabilizes around consistency rather than mood. Social dynamics shift almost invisibly. Conversations shorten because there is less emotional material to analyze. Gossip loses traction because there are no repeated frustrations to circulate. Colleagues approach directly instead of cautiously navigating emotional terrain. Even disagreement becomes more respectful when reaction cannot be predicted. Some interpret this restraint as distance. They may accuse the man of withholding or disengaging. Yet, outcomes begin speaking where explanations once stood. Projects complete without drama. Boundaries appear without argument. Dependence decreases without confrontation. Respect grows not through persuasion, but through absence of volatility. Danger emerges because perception becomes aligned with capability instead of emotion. Others hesitate before creating problems around someone whose limits remain private. They negotiate carefully because they cannot anticipate response. And slowly, without announcement, influence gathers around the man whose words stopped leaking frustration and began protecting consequence long before it ever needed to be spoken aloud. Lesson 10. The first principle within times. The day you stop complaining, you become dangerous. Times is that danger does not begin when a man becomes louder. It begins when he becomes unreadable. Most people associate strength with confrontation, raised voices, visible dominance. They expect anger to announce itself before action follows. But predictability is comfort, even when it appears aggressive. True disruption arrives without rehearsal. Complaining makes behavior transparent. Others learn how long patience lasts, what tone signals surrender, which inconvenience finally provokes reaction. Once those limits are known, pressure becomes calculated. A difficult colleague delays response because he knows frustration will eventually spill into words. A manipulative acquaintance pushes boundaries because apology reliably restores peace. Emotional patterns become tools placed quietly in other hands. Silence removes those tools. When complaints disappear, observers search for explanation. Has acceptance replaced resistance? Has interest faded? Or has judgment simply moved inward? Uncertainty forces caution. Human instinct avoids provoking outcomes it cannot predict. The restrained man does not threaten, he does not posture. Yet space forms around him because no one knows where tolerance ends. Time has proven that restraint unsettles more deeply than anger. Anger provides information. It exposes priorities and fear simultaneously. Silence offers none. Decisions begin appearing without emotional warning. Access quietly reduces. Opportunities are accepted or refused without discussion. Relationships reorganize themselves because expectations were never negotiated publicly. Consider conflict between two men. One argues openly, explaining every grievance. The argument grows familiar. Both sides understand rhythm and limits. Resolution becomes performance rather than transformation. Another man listens without complaint. Days later, boundaries appear through action. Access changes. Collaboration ends. Consequences arrive detached from emotion. Which one leaves a lasting impression? The dangerous man is not the loudest, he is the least explainable. Danger here is not violence, it is independence. A man who no longer complains stops requesting emotional permission to act. He does not gather agreement before adjusting course. He does not warn others through frustration that patience is thinning. Action replaces announcement. Those around him experience results before they understand intention. There is also a profound internal shift. Without complaint, identity detaches from circumstance. Mood stops dictating direction. Bad days lose authority over decisions. Energy accumulates because emotional recovery no longer consumes attention. Silence becomes a container where thought matures before movement begins. Some will interpret this transformation as coldness. Others will accuse him of becoming distant or difficult to read. They are correct about one thing: access has changed. Not because empathy disappeared, but because discipline now filters expression. Words are spent where they create consequence, not relief. Social environments reorganize themselves around this unpredictability. Manipulation fails more often. Drama loses audience. Negotiations shorten because emotional leverage finds no entry point. Respect forms quietly, sometimes reluctantly, around the man whose reactions cannot be rehearsed by others in advance. And eventually, the realization settles among those watching. Nothing dramatic announced the change. No speech declared new boundaries. Complaints simply ended. Yet, outcomes began arriving faster, resistance meeting firmer ground, conversations carrying unexpected weight. Because the day explanation stopped seeking witnesses was the day intention stopped asking permission to become action. If this message met you at the right moment, don't let it end as another passing thought. Subscribe to Austere Mind, not for motivation, but for clarity you can return to when noise begins to take control again. Write in the comments the one complaint you decided to abandon today. Not explanations, just the decision. Silence, once chosen, deserves witnesses who understand its weight.